WITCHBOARD is a 1986 film from future genre workhorse Kevin S. Tinney about the rivalry between two former friends, the culmination of that rivalry over a malevolent Ouija board, and their eventual reconciliation against the backdrop of a satanic tragedy. This video contains spoilers, so consider watching the film first before you continue. And if you like what you see, click the like button, share the video, subscribe to the channel, and make sure to click the little bell to be notified for new videos. Brendan Sinclair is a kind of pretentious twit that somehow combines the worst of the New Atheist movement with New Age woo.
How do you explain the creation of God?
He's always existed.
So is the universe.
When we meet him, he's attending the party of former friend Jim Morar, who spends most of the night grousing that Brandon showed up in the first place.
Who's the guy in the $800 suit?
It's Brandon Sinclair.
Of the Sinclair Vineyards?
Brandon busts out his Ouija board and talks to a kid named David, who died in the 1950s. Before David can ask what happened to his favorite movie actor, star of Bedtime for Bonzo Ronald Reagan, Jim starts making fun of the whole thing, implying that it's all a hoax. David is so upset that he slashes Brandon's tires in retaliation, thus making the argument for why you don't invite straight people to Pride. Brandon is so distraught that he forgets his Ouija board at Jim's place. Jim's apartment gets wrecked up by David, who likes to open cupboards and smash stuff on the ground. Brandon realizes he left his Ouija board behind and worries that David might try to do something to get back at Jim. Brandon wants the Ouija board back, but because Jim is a twat lawful and they're still feuding, he lords it over him. David ups the ante though, and Jim's best friend Lloyd is killed at Jim's construction site. Jim and Brandon agree to set aside their differences to vanquish David, even going so far as to hire a psychic named Zarabeth, played by human pebble in a shoe Kathleen Wilhoit.
No prop!
Zarabeth talks to David and tells him to go away because he's freaking people out and no one in this yuppie movie likes children anyway. Zarabeth confides in Brandon that she felt a different presence though. Malfeitor. She tries to look up the spirit, but a ghostly presence gives her the old Uncle Phil special. Concerned that something larger is happening, Brandon buys a new spiritual talking board from Temu, and he and Brandon try to contact David outside the regular group chat. David says he hasn't been talking to anyone since the party, so whoever is doing this is catfishing Brandon and Jim. That whoever cuts loose some conveniently placed barrels and buries the hatchet right in Brandon's face.
Gnarly.
Jim finally realizes his love for Brandon and cries before returning home and confronting Malfeitor in the climactic man versus ghost battle. It's a pretty standard little haunty flick. Solid 2-star affair here. Hey, you might be saying. Wasn't Tawny Katane in this movie? To which I say, did it sound like she really needed to be? Okay, so the Ouija board. If 1980s horror cinema has taught us anything, besides, the dangers of premarital sex in the woods, it's that you do not mess with the talking board. It is a one-way ticket to demonic possession, pea soup vomit, and a serious haunting of your very beige suburban home. And Kevin S. Tinney's 1986 cult classic WITCHBOARD seems to follow that recipe to the letter. We've got our curious heroine Linda, who gets a little too into chatting with a spirit named David. We've got her concerned but skeptical boyfriend Jim. And we've got the spooky shenanigans that follow. Standard stuff. But if you watch it again, something feels a little off. The ghost story is fine, it does its job. But the real high-voltage, nail-biting capital D drama of the movie is between two guys.
You guys were friends?
Best friends.
You have Jim, the boyfriend, and Brandon, his old friend turned gigantic tool who shows up to a party with a Ouija board, seemingly just to pick fights with people.
For your information, dude, the Ouija board has been around since recorded history.
And from the second he pipes up, the movie stops being about Linda and the ghost, and it starts being about Jim and Brandon's simmering pot of resentment, jealousy, and, let's be honest, a whole mess of unresolved feelings.
I told you he was an asshole.
I know you did.
Linda, the woman who is supposedly the main character, basically becomes a human telephone for these two to work out their issues. So it begs the question, is WITCHBOARD really a cautionary tale about dabbling with the occult? Or is it an accidental documentary about the single most terrifying force in the universe? Unspoken male emotion.
God, I love you.
So to really dig into why this goofy 1980s movie feels less like a haunting and more like a long, awkward therapy session for two guys who refuse to talk about their feelings, we need to put on our grad school hats for a minute. Don't worry, I'll make it quick. It won't hurt a bit. We need to talk about a concept from literary theorist Eve Kosofsky Sedgwick called male homosocial desire. Homosocial is one of those $10 academic words that sounds way more complicated than it actually is. It's not about who wants to sleep with whom, or at least it's not necessarily about who wants to sleep with whom. Sedgwick uses it to describe a whole spectrum of intense bonds between men in a patriarchal society, from friendship and mentorship all the way down to jealousy and rivalry. The theory goes that in a system where men hold the power, their most intense relationships are with other men. But, and this is the important part, that energy often can't be expressed directly, man to man. There's this weird social force field that we call homophobia. So the desire, the rivalry, the feelings, they get triangulated. They get routed through a woman. She becomes the conduit for the otherwise unexpressed emotions and aggressions between two men. She's the symbolic prize, the territory they fight over, the excuse they use to stay in each other's lives. And Witchboard is maybe one of the most perfect, gloriously unsubtle examples of this ever put to film. The central relationship isn't the romance between Jim and Linda, it's the potent mix of camaraderie and antagonism between Jim and his ex-buddy Brandon. Linda is basically just the playing field where their long simmering rivalry finally gets to boil over. The movie sets this up from the very first scene. We open at a party at Jim and Linda's surprisingly opulent home, and everything seems fine. You know, in that aggressively normal 1980s movie way. But the second Brandon shows up, the whole vibe shifts. You can feel the tension immediately. And what does he bring with him? The Ouija board. Brandon doesn't just casually leave it on the table, though. He performs.
Wait, what, a Ouija board?
Ouija. It comes from the French and German words for yes. Oui and ja. Ouija.
He stages this whole theatrical demonstration of his supernatural knowledge. This isn't a friendly gesture, it's a power play. He's a provocateur, deliberately wedging himself in the middle of their life to destabilize their relationship. Every word he says to Jim is dripping with condescension, a barely hidden competitiveness. He immediately positions himself as the expert on the occult, the one who understands the rules, which is a direct shot at Jim's role as Linda's supposed partner and protector. He's basically walking into Jim's house and saying, "Hey, cool relationship you got there, but you don't know how to protect your girlfriend from the spooky stuff." Don't worry, I do. And notice his attitude toward Linda. It's proprietary, almost dismissive. She's not a person he's engaging with. She's the symbolic ground he's trying to reclaim. And the Ouija board is just the weapon he's chosen for this particular battle in their ongoing personal war. So from the jump, the real conflict is established, and it has nothing to do with a ghost named David, a woman named Linda, or a serial killer named Malfeitor. It's Jim versus Brandon. And as we're about to see, the board they're playing with becomes a portal not just for spirits, but for all the repressed toxicity that defines their relationship. So Brandon uses the Ouija to open a door. But what comes through isn't just a ghost from the past, it's a reflection of the toxic masculinity that's been festering between these two men the whole time. And don't get your jockstrap in a twist because I use the term toxic masculinity. You watch the film and tell me that these are two guys who have their emotional shit together.
Because you're not capable of giving a shit about anyone but
Shut
yourself.
up, Brandon.
And when you get tired of Linda, you're gonna walk away from her too.
Shut up, Brandon.
Just like you did with school. Just like you did with your parents. Just like you did with... Shut up!
This gets at the core idea in horror analysis, something the legendary critic Robin Wood called the return of the repressed. The basic gist is that our society, our culture, is built on repressing a lot of messy, ugly stuff. Our anxieties, our taboo desires, especially when it comes to things like sexuality and power. Horror movies are the pressure valve. They take all that unpleasant stuff we've shoved down into the cultural subconscious and let it bubble back up in the form of a monster. The monster is our collective baggage. Just, wearing a spooky mask. And in Witchboard, the big bad evil spirit, the serial killer Carlos Malfeitor, isn't just some random entity that Linda happened to dial up. He's a monstrous manifestation of the toxic masculinity that underpins Jim and Brandon's rivalry. And if you don't believe me, think about it this way. Malfeitor is a figure of pure, unfiltered male aggression. A predator who preys on the vulnerable. He is the logical, horrifying endpoint of their petty competition and their unchecked egos. The Ouija board then becomes a medium where they can finally confront the dark reflections of their own desires for dominance and control. It's basically their personal psychic battleground. This is why the supernatural threat in Witchboard isn't really an external force invading the home. but an internal one, erupting from the cracks in relationships. The horror isn't just some ghost from the outside, it's the breakdown of the distinction between the self and other. The boundaries between Jim and Brandon, between their own identities and the monster they're fighting, start to get real blurry real fast. So if the supernatural horror is really just a monstrous projection of the central male rivalry, what does that do to our supposed main character, Linda? Well, basically it turns her into a piece of furniture. And as we're about to see, not even a particularly useful one. At first, Witchboard seems to be setting up Linda as the classic final girl. You know the trope, famously identified by scholar Carol J. Clover. The resourceful, intelligent, and morally upright young woman who survives the whole ordeal and confronts the killer at the end. And for the first few minutes, Linda fits the bill. She's our point of view. She's curious. She's the one driving the initial interaction with the supernatural. But as soon as Jim and Brandon's rivalry kicks into high gear, Linda's agency gets systematically stripped away. Her personality is erased, replaced by a vacant, childlike dependency on the men around her, and she goes from being an active character to a passive object, a human prop in someone else's story. And it doesn't take too long into the movie for that to happen, as Tawny Katane struggles to stay relevant by throwing some of the most magnificent side-eye this side of Sophia Loren. Which brings us to one of my favorite tools for pop media criticism, the sexy lamp test. Coined by comic book writer Kelly Sue DeConnick, it's a beautifully simple metric. You look at a female character in a story and ask, if you replaced her with a sexy lamp with a note attached, would the plot still fundamentally work? If the answer is yes, then you don't have a character, you have a prop. And folks, Linda Brewster fails the sexy lamp test spectacularly. In fact, as I showed you in the opening, you don't even need a lamp. You could honestly just replace Linda with the Ouija board itself. This alluring, mysterious object that brings a curse into Jim's house, the narrative would remain structurally identical. Jim still feels a proprietary need to keep the board away from Brandon because it's in his house and he loves to troll Brandon. Brandon still shows up with all his occult woo-splaining to interfere, using his supposed expertise to one-up Jim. Their rivalry escalates with the board sitting right there as its silent, passive trophy. The fact that our leading lady is functionally interchangeable with the prop really does say it all. She's just a prize that the guys are fighting over. She's a problem that needs to be solved. This isn't just an accident of lazy writing either. It's a direct symptom of that homosocial triangle. For the emotional and psychological drama between the two men to take center stage, Linda must be rendered an object. And nowhere is this more obvious than in the film's climax, where the resolution of this whole supernatural hot mess isn't about Linda conquering her demons, but about Jim and Brandon finally hugging it out. You know, with an ex-murderer. In the final confrontation, Linda is the quintessential damsel in distress, completely helpless and waiting to be rescued. The real emotional peak of the movie isn't defeating the ghost. It's the moment the two male rivals put aside their differences and team up. When Brandon is tragically killed, it's not just a sad moment. In the logic of the film, it's the ultimate act of male bonding. His death served to solidify his bond with Jim, basically sacrificing himself to give Jim the final emotional level up he needs to become a mature and self-assured man. And admittedly, Jim finally getting in touch with his emotions enough to openly weep over Brandon's dead body is poignant and on theme, especially given Brandon's exposition dump about Jim being so emotionally constipated that he didn't even cry at his own father's funeral.
I've known him since I was 7, and I've never seen him cry once. Not for anybody or anything.
To its credit, the film casts Jim's victory over the monster as a direct result of the lessons he's learned through his fraught relationship with Brandon.
You know what I'm afraid of more than anything else? That I'll never be able to love anyone.
So the film's final shot isn't of a triumphant final girl who has faced down evil and survived. It's of a chastened and subdued woman who has been returned to her proper place within the patriarchal order. Her entire terrifying ordeal, the possession, the psychological torment, ultimately just served a narrative purpose, to facilitate the emotional journey of the male protagonist. Look, on the surface, Witchboard is a perfectly competent and fun 80s supernatural horror flick. It's a B-movie and it knows it. But if you look a little closer, it becomes this incredibly compelling and complex story about the dynamics of male relationships. The film's true horror isn't in the ghosts or the jump scares, but in the unspoken, noxious, and destructive emotions flowing between its two male leads. Linda, our supposed hero, is just a conduit, a pawn in a game she doesn't even know she's playing. By looking at it through a lens like Eve Sedgwick's, the movie transforms from a simple ghost story into this surprisingly nuanced exploration of masculinity, using horror tropes to get at the often monstrous nature of the bonds that exist between men. And Witchboard is hardly alone. The 1980s were rife with these kinds of anxieties about gender and power, And you can see this same kind of homosocial subtext bubbling just beneath the surface in all sorts of horror films from the era. Think about the intense, fraught relationship between Charlie Brewster and his vampiric neighbor Jerry Dandridge in Fright Night, or the notoriously queer subtext of A Nightmare on Elm Street 2. By looking past the obvious scares and analyzing the deeper psychological dramas at play, we can see how the horror genre has always had this incredible power to reflect the anxieties of the culture that creates it. Sometimes the scariest monster isn't the one with claws, but the one you're not allowed to talk about. Stay warm, stay safe, wash your hands, return your shopping carts, make good choices, and I'll see you next time.
Here I go again.